So we've got the sign of the end of the age preceding the sign of the second coming of Yeshua, or the rapture of Yeshua, even though the second coming, aka the rapture, precedes the day of the Lord being initiated, or the end of the age. So Van Kampen says we're going to do this, we're going to explain this by first considering in this chapter what will be the sign of the end of the age. This is chapter 14 in his book. And then in the next chapter, which is chapter 15, like you can see right here, Van Kampen says, and then in the context, in the next chapter, we'll turn to the second question, what will be the sign of Christ's coming? Okay. Christ's answers to disciples' questions are given along with one of our Lord's strongest warnings, a warning that every Christian who enters the 70th week needs to heed with utter seriousness. By the way, I do not believe we are in the 70th week just yet. I know many teachers who do believe, close friends of mine who believe that we are already in the tribulation week, considering what's going on in Israel with the war on Hamas right now, and the turmoil in the Middle East that's been brewing for so long and now is broken out into full-scale war. Many Bible prophecy teachers believe that this means that we are in the 70th week. We are in the tribulation week. I don't hold to that position, but I do think we're right at the doorstep. What I'm looking for, and I'm saying this just by way of context, what I'm anticipating for the 70th week to commence is that arrow on the far left of your screen. Antichrist makes covenant. That's the beginning of the 7th week. This corresponds or correlates with Antichrist signs covenant on the far left of this particular arrow. This particular screen as well. This particular chart is that is the beginning of the 7 years. I don't believe we're there yet, but we're right at the far left of that arrow, or far left of this one. In other words, the first seal hasn't happened yet. The first seal hasn't been cracked open by Yeshua, the Lamb in heaven. But the events that we're seeing unfold in Israel seem to be propelling us towards the necessity of a peace treaty between Israel and her Arab neighbors, the hostile ones at least, and something that the world will probably witness, on all the TV screens and news outlets and social media devices everywhere around the world. Everybody's going to watch Israel sign a peace treaty with her Arab neighbors. I mean, just like they did with all the other ones that ever took place between some major world leader, like a world president. Like most recently, we had Trump standing there between the Middle East leaders there and what was that, the Abraham Accords. So that's really what we're looking at. Let's keep going for the next 15 minutes or so. Van Kampen, speaking of the Antichrist, he says, hoping to lure these believers out of hiding, Antichrist will dispatch many false Christs and false prophets who will show such seemingly divine signs and wonders that if God did not secure them in the faith, many of his elect would be ensnared and executed. Thus, Jesus warned of that day, saying, then if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and show great signs and wonders, so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Behold, I've told you in advance. If therefore they say to you, behold, he's in the wilderness, do not go forth, or behold, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe them. Again, this idea that Yeshua is warning his disciples, and now us by inclusion, because these words have been preserved for us, warning us that when this time period comes and these seals begin to break, and we've got, going back to this chart down at the bottom, we've got the seal number 1 with the Antichrist, but this includes false Christs along with the main false Christ. So we have not just the chief false Messiah, Antichrist himself, but we also have many other Christ wannabes, many other false Christs that are going to be on the scene. The idea is that Yeshua is saying, look, when the time comes for me to actually return and the true Christ actually comes back to earth, it's not going to be a secret event. It's not going to be, hey, go up into the upper room, there he is, or go out into the desert where he's been hiding or something like that. The force of his words seem to indicate that it's going to be some monumental, earth-shattering event, and well, it should be, because there's only one true Christ. So that's the point being made, I believe, by don't go here, don't go there, behold, he's in the wilderness, do not go forth, behold, he's in the inner rooms. It's not going to be some secret, hidden event that only a few people are going to be witnessing and that the rest of the world doesn't know about. Indeed, just like the Antichrist himself, I believe, will be a worldwide event, although we won't know he's Antichrist right away, right? Why would Israel sign a peace treaty with someone they know is going to cut their throats 3.5 years into this peace treaty? I mean, supposed peace treaty. And there will be a measure of peace at that point in time. I mean, but why would Israel sign a peace treaty with someone they know is basically Satan incarnate? The point is, they don't know he's Satan incarnate. They don't know it's a covenant with death. At least they don't know that it's Antichrist. They know they're not trusting in God in their hearts, I believe, but God's bringing them to this position so that he can deal with them, so that he can break Israel's stubbornness, so that she can be prepared to meet the true Savior, which is Yeshua, who will come a little bit later on, right? Antichrist comes first, and then Yeshua comes later on. Picking up Van Kampen's notes here, he talks about how that Christ's warning here is specific. It is a warning to the church and Israel, by the way, not to be deceived by the great signs and wonders that false Christs and false prophets will perform during the terrible days of Antichrist before the sign of the end of the age is given. We do not know what these false signs and wonders will be, but they will most certainly be awesome displays of power. So awesome, Van Kampen says, in fact, that even the elect will be tempted to come out of hiding where they would fall into the deadly grasp of Antichrist. Remember, we're talking about the Great Tribulation has already commenced with the abomination of desolation at the midpoint of the week and the implementation of the worldwide sign wherein you cannot buy or sell unless you have this mark, right? The mark of the beast, the image that is set up and that you have to worship, the number of his name, etc. These things are indications that the Antichrist is already in control. Whether he's a European Antichrist, we're not certain. Whether he's a Muslim Antichrist, again, we're not certain. But what we do know is that up to this point, according to the normative reading of Scripture, the Jewish people in Jerusalem will have already been performing sacrifices when the midpoint happens. So there will have been some edifice, like some form of tabernacle or altar, or at least some form of altar that allows for sacrificial animals to be placed up there, that will have been constructed and have been allowed by the Antichrist and the parties that brokered this peace, right? The hostile Muslim and Arab neighbors that surround Israel currently. They will have agreed to this peace treaty, which will have allowed Israel to reinstate these sacrifices. But at the midpoint, according to prophecies in multiple places, the Antichrist is going to cut those sacrifices short by abominating whatever edifice is there, whether it be a full-blown temple or whether it just be a tabernacle structure, a mishkan, we're not sure. But it's in that time frame that we're looking at this intense persecution, not just against Israel, but against Christians worldwide, this persecution known as the tribulation. And that's why Van Kampen's talking about Antichrist trying to tempt Christians from coming out of hiding with the false signs and wonders. Also, you have to remember that the two witnesses will be on the scene soon. If I'm correct, if I got my timing right, the two witnesses will show up at the midpoint as well and begin prophesying for 1,260 days. So either they show up at the front of the 7-year time period, and then they stop prophesying at the midpoint because they get killed by the Antichrist, or they show up at the midpoint and they prophesy all the way up until the end of the 70th week. And I believe, give me a second, let me just grab a different resource and look for that, all right? All right, grabbed my actual copy of the sign off the shelf here. I'm holding it in my hand. Let me see. The two witnesses show up. Looking at my chart here. Where's the midpoint? There it is. All right, yeah, I was right. The two witnesses, according to Van Kampen, which is also according to the view that I hold to, the two witnesses show up at the midpoint. So they show up at this point in time as well, right at the kickoff of the tribulation and the beginning with the mark of the beast and the implementation of the mark of the beast and the abomination of desolation, the occupation of Jerusalem. The two witnesses show up at this point in time. So there will be lying signs and wonders by the Antichrist, but there'll also be the two witnesses who are also performing signs and wonders to bring people into a knowledge of the truth, right? They're witnesses on God's side. So there will be people who were born during the tribulation, obviously, because the rapture hasn't taken place yet. Let's keep reading Van Kampen. He talks about Christ commands his own with the strongest words, do not go forth, do not believe them. Speaking of these false messiahs that will be running around all over the place in verse 26 of Matthew 24. In other words, do not be deceived, Van Kampen says, by any of these false signs, no matter how impressive they may be. Wait instead for the real sign, the sign of the end of the age. Then and only then will you see the sign of Christ's coming. He continues in the Olivet Discourse. We're wrapping it up now since we've got about 5 minutes left. In the Olivet Discourse, we'll probably finish chapter 14's notes here, and then we'll jump right into chapter 15 next week. Van Kampen says, in the Olivet Discourse, Christ had just explained to his disciples that when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, then there will be a great tribulation such as not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever shall be. So what's taking place in Israel right now is horrific, but it's certainly not tribulation. It's not the end of the world just yet. So I don't think we're right there just yet. But again, whatever takes place in Israel is certainly related to the 70th week of Daniel. I just don't believe we're right at the 70th week just yet. Continuing with Yeshua's quote, unless those days had been cut short. What days? The days of tribulation, not the days of the 70th week. Unless those days had been cut short, no life of those opposed to Antichrist would have been saved. The bracketed part of those opposed to Antichrist is Van Kampen's insert. And so that's a quote from Matthew 24:15, 21, and 22. That is why Van Kampen said Christ's warning was so specific. Do not go forth. Do not believe them. But with the warning comes the promise of Christ, quote, but for the sake of the elect, those days shall be cut short. This one little promise contained in two short words, cut short, is indeed pregnant with meaning, as we shall see. If the persecution of Antichrist were permitted to run its full course throughout the 42 months allotted to him, which begins at the midpoint of the week, we talk about 42 months allotted to him, no life would have been saved. But Christ promises to cut short this terrible time of persecution, not Antichrist's 42-month time allotment to rule over the earth. The Greek word translated cut short literally means to amputate. Thus, the promise of Christ is that the persecution of the elect of God, of both the woman and the rest of her offspring, right? Remember Revelation chapter 12. This persecution will not be permitted to run the full course of the time allotted to Antichrist, i.e. the 42 months, the 3.5 years. Instead, the time of persecution will be amputated, cut short, even though Antichrist himself will continue on until he meets with, quote-unquote, complete destruction, one that is decreed that will be poured out on the one who makes desolate, end quote. That's a quote from Daniel 9:27b, speaking of the little horn, a.k.a. the Antichrist. And then, as we're continuing to look at this sign in chapter 14 of Van Kampen's book, Van Kampen says, and so back to the question of the disciples, what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? To which Christ responded, quote, but immediately after the tribulation persecution of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. And then all the tribes of the earth shall mourn or will mourn. And then they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds with power and great glory. So that's a quote from Matthew 24:29 and 30. Van Kampen adds, if the counterfeit signs created by the false Christs and false prophets will be stunningly impressive, what of the true sign that will mark the end of the age? In describing this sign, Christ begins by saying that this sign will occur, quote, immediately after the tribulation of those days, end quote, right? That's Matthew 24:29a. Referring back to the Great Tribulation of verse 21, whose days will be cut short when Christ returns, of verse 22, right? That's the context. Van Kampen goes on to say that he then continues, speaking of Yeshua, he then goes on to paraphrase the classic Day of the Lord passage from Isaiah, which explains that on this fearful day, the stars of heaven and their constellations will not flash forth their light. The sun will be dark when it rises, and the moon will not shed its light. Thus I will punish the world for its evil. Isaiah 13, verse 10 and 11. So we're beginning to see that what Yeshua gave us in, park it there so you can see that quote, what Yeshua gave us in Matthew corresponds to what was already given in the prophets of old. So Israel has no excuse. We know that Israel of today is not reading the New Testament, so it's understandable why they are going to miss a lot of these details that show up in the Olivet Discourse, as well as the book of Revelation that John penned for us, as well as Paul's letters in the book of Thessalonians, and the other New Testament writings that contain prophetic passages such as 2 Peter and things like that. But what Israel does have is the Tanakh, the Old Testament, according to Christians, right? Genesis through what Christians call Malachi, but what Jewish people reorder according to end in 2nd Chronicles, or really the Christian order was reordered, I think. The point I'm trying to make is that Israel has no excuse because they've got so much prophecy concerning the end time events that have already been laid as a foundation, so that when we get to the New Testament writings dealing with eschatology, we can properly understand those particular parts of the Bible. But Israel also has no excuse. So let me look real quick and see how much more I want to read with Van Kampen. I do want to keep reading just maybe 1 or 2 more minutes, and then we'll close this part of our study. Speaking of the Isaiah passage that we just read about, Van Kampen reminds us that this corresponds identically to the classic Day of the Lord passage in Joel, where the Lord proclaims through the prophet that, quote, the sun will be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and awesome day the Lord comes. Joel 2:31, emphasis added by Van Kampen. Later, Joel describes this sign that precedes the day of the Lord in more detail. Quote, for the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision, later on known as the valley of Jehoshaphat. The valley of decision, the sun and moon grow dark and the stars lose their brilliance. Joel 3:14 and 15. In other words, continuing, I'll keep going just for a few more paragraphs. In other words, from these passages, we see, Van Kampen says, that the sign of the end of the age, the day of the Lord, will be the sign that the Lord gave Joel, the same sign the Lord gave Isaiah, and also the same sign Christ gave his disciples, so that they would know when the end of the age was about to occur, when Christ would return to earth for the judgment of the citizens of Satan's earthly kingdom. Later in this chapter, we will see that it is also the same sign Christ gave John in the book of Revelation, announcing the day of the Lord at the 6th seal. Let me jump over to this chart. Look down at the bottom of your screen. See where it says 6 seal signs in the sky? And then when you let your eyes follow along that line up to the top of the screen, it corresponds with the day of the Lord, and that corresponds to the arrow pointing down to the coming of the Son of Man, date unknown. Using this chart, you don't see that, but in this one, using the signs or the seals, you can see that. So Van Kampen continues, thus there's total agreement in Scripture as to what the sign will be, but there's also complete consistency as to when the sign will occur, which is immediately after the tribulation of those days, Matthew 24:29a, but before the great and awesome day of the Lord, Joel 2:31. You have to catch that important detail and the correlation. Christ, therefore, Van Kampen reminds us, Christ, therefore, explicitly links together the sign of the end of the age that occurs, quote, immediately after tribulation, in quote, Matthew 24:29a, with the sign prophesied in the Old Testament announcing the day of the Lord, which will only occur when the great tribulation by Antichrist is, quote, unquote, cut short by Christ's return. And then he continues in the very next verse. Christ goes on to explain that the second sign, when the, quote, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, end quote, verse 30 of Matthew, will follow in immediate succession to the sign of the end of the age, which we already saw earlier. He continues, only after these two signs are given back to back, and then we have a quote from Matthew again, then all those tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory, which is verse 30 of Matthew 24. And we'll read this final paragraph, and then we'll stop here where we can see the paragraph heading the sign of the end of the age. Van Kampen continues, from this, we may conclude these three things. So listen up, I'm drawing my study to a close. First, the coming of Christ at the day of the Lord will be preceded by two successive stunning signs. Here they are. The sign of the end of the age and the sign of Christ's coming, which we will look at in more detail in the following chapter, which is chapter 15 of this book. Let me just pop over and show it to you. It's right there. Okay, we'll look at that next week. He continues. So first, we got the coming of Christ at the day of the Lord preceded by two successive signs. Second, both signs and the events they announce will occur after the tribulation, or more correctly, when the persecution of Antichrist against the elect of God is cut short. Reference Matthew 24:22. And third, and we're closing with this, both signs are given just before we will see the actual coming of the Son of Man on the clouds of the sky, which is the rapture. Therefore, he says, the sign of the end of the age will be seen in the heavenlies after the great tribulation is cut short, just before the sign of Christ's coming is given. And that's where we'll stop tonight. We'll pick up next week where you can see Van Kampen's note that says the sign of the end of the age. And we'll just talk a little bit more about that before we turn to the sign of Christ's coming. All right, but that'll do it for Eschatology, a biblical study of end-time events.